Okay, looks like we have a good crowd here today. I hope everybody is really enjoying the conference so far and getting a lot out of it. Your microphones are muted right now and your cameras should be off. At the end, when we have discussion, you're welcome to turn your cameras on if you choose to and unmute your microphone. You can also ask questions through the chat stream if you want to type them so you don't forget. If you're not worried about that, you can type them at the end when we open it for question and answer. And today I'm super excited, super pleased to announce Kathryn Robb for legislative update and advocacy tips for survivors. Many of us are advocates here and kind of would like to be more like you when I grow up. Kathryn's the executive director of Child US Advocacy. She's a lawyer specializing in legislative advocacy, sexual abuse, child protection laws, and statute of limitation reform. Kathryn's been fighting for meaningful child sex abuse legislation for 14 years. As an outspoken survivor, she uses her voice and legal training to pass laws that protect children and give victims justice. A co-founder of New Yorkers Against Hidden Predators, Kathryn worked closely with New York leaders to pass the Child Victims Act, yay, and the one-year CVA Extension Act. Kathryn's also a member of the board at Mass Kids, which is an advocacy group out of Massachusetts. So, welcome, Kathryn.
Thank you. Thank you. First, I just would like to thank, I'd like to thank everyone at SNAP. I'd like to thank Zach, and just the organization itself is wonderful. I've been to many, many conferences through the years. I've spoken, I spoke way back when Barbara Blaine was around with us, God rest her soul. And I also just want to thank all the brave advocates and survivors for the work that they do and for allowing me to speak. So thank you very much. As Mary said, I'm also a survivor of child sexual abuse in the family. My abuse started when I was about 8, 9, and ended when I was about 14. So I think it gives me a different sort of vision that we all have as survivors to be able to communicate more effectively with legislative leaders all over the country now, and just to really have that that base of understanding as a survivor. Child US Advocacy is a 501c4, and we work very closely with Child USA, which is a 501c3, especially with the leading expert, Professor Marcy Hamilton. We are really a 1-2 punch in the advocacy that we do all over the country. Child USA is the think tank, and Child US Advocacy is the advocacy lobbying type of arm. There are some things that Child US Advocacy can do that Child USA cannot do. So it's really a nice 1-2 punch in our efforts all over the country. A little bit about what we do. We educate lawmakers and governors. We testify before all sorts of different legislative committees, primarily judicial committees, sometimes codes committees, to really get them to understand the full problem of child sexual abuse, its ubiquitous nature, and to have them understand the science of it, and also the need for changes to make children safer, and to also give all survivors justice. That is our agenda, is to give all survivors justice. So in accordance with that legislative committee testifying, we also of course submit testimony and sometimes memorandums of law. We also submit amicus briefs in the court. We've been doing that frequently. We submitted one against the Archdiocese in Rockville Center, New York, who raised that the window that we just passed there was unconstitutional. And we recently filed one in New Jersey as well. So we get a lot of these battles from either the Catholic Church, Boy Scouts of America, other big organizations. And so even after many, many years of fighting to get the legislation passed, our fight is not over, because typically we see these complaints that are the legislation that we work so hard to pass may be unconstitutional for a variety of reasons, usually due process. And so we have to fight those battles as well after we've won the initial legislative battle. We, of course, draft and edit a lot of legislation. The language is really important. So getting the language and the drafting right, and maybe even editing some legislation that's already been drafted by lawmakers and sponsors, we offer that service as well. We, of course, speak at press conferences. We appear on local and national news, and we write op-eds to really educate the public, but also to turn up the heat often. We will often turn up the heat under those legislative leaders that are just not budging. So we try to submit those as frequently as possible. Here's my dear friend Marcy Hamilton, and really the leading scholar on all of this. We were on a talk show in New York, and this is what typically happens when we're dealing with a leader, and this happened to be the Senate Majority Leader in the New York Senate, John Flanagan. We fought him just tooth and nail for years to bring the bill to the floor. For many years, we actually had the votes, but we couldn't get those legislative leaders to take their finger off the bill and allow it to go to the Senate floor for a vote. The photo on the right is we are outside his home at 7 in the morning protesting, and lots of protesters showed up. It was a wonderful show of force. And the photo on the left, we were protesting at a fundraiser at a Trump golf course in New York. And so, we just turn the heat up in any way that we can. And we often, we resort to shaming techniques. We had this, this document was all over the legislative office building in Albany. And we used it multiple times because, again, this particular legislative leader was just refused to push the bill forward, even though we knew that we had the votes. So it was really a battle against the leadership. And we see this a lot, unfortunately, in different legislative bodies all over the country. So this was actually one of the last times I spoke before COVID hit. This was in the Kansas Judiciary Committee, trying to pass the bill there on statute of limitations reform. There is no easy way to get to Kansas, folks, but we did it in a day, got there and back, testifying before that committee. Our legislative initiatives, right now, the most important one is statute of limitations reform for child sexual abuse, but we also do other things. We really tackle all issues that affect children. So any sort of child protection legislation, we want to be behind it, support it via testimony or written testimony, whatever it is. Ending conversion therapy for LGBTQ youth is on our list, ending child marriage, eliminating exemptions for childhood vaccinations, ending female genital mutilation on minors, and family court reform. So really anything to do with protecting children, we are in that fight in pretty much every jurisdiction. But right now our focus is on changing the statute of limitations for child sexual abuse and protecting children and giving victims the justice they so deserve. One of the things that we use in our testimony in our op-eds, in our, presentation on national and local news is we draw on the expertise of medical and legal academics, and we use evidence-based research and data. We really focus on data when we are trying to push legislative bodies to change their laws and to change their policy around this, this terrible problem of child sexual abuse and child abuse in general, but child sexual abuse especially. It is a ubiquitous problem. To me, and I've made this argument, that it is the true pandemic that we have been living in for years. So we really push science and data. We educate lawmakers on the relatively new science of traumatology, and specifically how the trauma affects children and the brains of children and their development, and how neural pathways that are being formed at these very formative years and even into elementary school and high school, and how they can be, those neural pathways can be so significantly altered and alter the minds and the brains of children. And we've seen this show up in many different facets of the overall well-being of a child and of a young adult. We spend a lot of time explaining some of the more medical terms about stress response and how stress response takes a toll on the body. And we'll educate lawmakers on what happens to the brain when it perceives danger, and what happens when that small part of the brain, the amygdala, is triggered by what it perceives as danger, and how it sends that stress message to the hypothalamus, which is really the command center of the brain. That's it. It's sort of always looking to protect, whether it be the fight or flight that we've heard so frequently. There's also a lot of evidence that there's a flight or freeze. And so we use a lot of this evidence on how that hypothalamus, sort of activates this nervous system response, and how when that is happening time and time again, when it becomes a chronic type of stress response, how that release of cortisol on the body, how it affects the minds of especially young children, how it changes neural pathways, how it contributes to memory, attention, anxiety, depression, addiction, all of those things. We really try to educate these lawmakers to understand why it is children respond a certain way, and of course why it is that survivors take such a long time to come forward. And as many of you probably already know, the average age that a survivor will come forward is in their 50s. And of course, by the time someone reaches their 50s, most statute of limitations have run, and they're barred to bring those claims forward. And so we're trying to educate the lawmakers to understand that this is real science, this is real data, and this is what victims of child sexual abuse experience, and how it affects their mind, their neural pathways, the way they handle stress, all of that, how they shut down. So we really try to educate them with a lot of science, and quite frankly, sometimes it takes a lot of convincing, sometimes it takes a lot of explaining, but we find that they are moved by science, they're moved by data, they're moved by research, evidence-based data. Really, it really helps our fight to pass these types of reform legislation. We talk, of course, about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. I'm sure most of you have heard about the ACE exam and the ACE test, excuse me, and how physical, emotional, sexual abuse, neglect, challenges in the home affect affect children and cause that heightened toxic stress that is really creates what I was just talking about when we think about how the brain responds to stress and the fight, flight, or freeze type of responses that the brain goes through, and what happens when young children are under a chronic state of stress, and the factors that the neurological factors that then later affect, you know, sort of health and risk behaviors, disease, disabilities, you know, social problems. You can see that on this chart here. And the evidence of early death for victims of child abuse and child sexual abuse are really startling. The evidence on the amount of disease, disability, social problems that survivors experience is quite compelling. And we share all of this when we are educating lawmakers. We also educate lawmakers and on the cost of child sexual abuse on society. And this is usually when their ears perk up. They're always interested in how they can, you know, save their particular state or jurisdiction, how they can save their systems from the heavy weight of cost. So we talked to them about that. Right now we have some data that the cost to a survivor on average is $282,000, almost $283,000, and billions of dollars annually. The burden on our social service systems, our medical health systems, our mental health systems, our medical systems, our educational systems, family systems, and of course, penal systems. There's some really compelling evidence out of the Bureau of Justice Statistics that at least in 2015, when the study was done, that 14.4% of men and 36.7% of women in prison all reported that they were abused before they were 18. And that's just an enormous amount of folks, and the cost and the weight on our penal system and our, you know, our police system, especially now as we're dealing with police reform and how the burden that police systems are experiencing. They really need to be educated on the effect of child sexual abuse, and also being able to spot child sexual abuse, respond to child sexual abuse, report child sexual abuse, ask the right questions if they suspect child abuse. So we're working with some of those systems as well to educate, but also to tell lawmakers that this is an enormous cost on our system. So we continue educating them with about those numbers as well. And the other thing I think I said earlier is just submitting these amicus Friends of the Court briefs to fight the constitutional challenges of window legislation. And these are just the first pages of these very long briefs that we write and submit to help maintain the status quo of the laws that we finally have passed. As many of you know already, 90% of victims never go to the authorities. And this goes back to the statistic of that the average age a victim comes forward is age 52. And so clearly those, you know, those courthouse doors are closed on most folks. And really, if so many folks don't go to the authorities, and we know why they don't go, we know why there's a delayed reporting, a delayed disclosure of this. I know it personally as a survivor, and we know it just based on the data, the research, that, you know, because of the shame, the fear, the embarrassment, all of the psychological effects. We understand this data, we understand the science, and We report all of this to, whether we're writing an op-ed, whether we're speaking to a committee, whether we are on a local or national news show, we report all of this data. And then the work of drafting strong legislation, this is something we're really committed to getting the language right. And when we see a draft of legislation, if we feel that there's a problem or a potential problem with language, we will work on editing legislation. And one of the things we really try to educate legislators on is sort of understanding the language in SOL reform legislation. So I thought this was important, especially for you folks that will be advocating on in your particular jurisdictions, to understand and to probably not just yourself understand, but to also educate the lawmakers that you're speaking to, whether you're making calls or you're meeting with them directly or even testifying, as so many brave survivors do, to understand what the difference is between extension, elimination, and of course, retroactive type of laws. Of course, we have revival language, which will revive previously barred claims, and sometimes there are dates on those, not always. And then of course we have window legislation, which is another type of retroactive legislation. And window legislation is simply a start and an end period where survivors can finally bring their claims, and we have a beginning and an end period. We have some jurisdictions that have passed, Vermont most notably, passed an open window that will never close. It's a permanent window. It's really great legislation, complete elimination, and a permanent window. We have used that legislation to introduce similar legislation in other jurisdictions. It's also important to note that there's bill language that we do not support, and we would advocate that most folks should not support, and that is age caps are absolutely offensive to us. Everyone has a right to justice in either revival or window legislation. Damages caps, any sort of monetary limits on liability are also offensive to us, and we will fight them as hard as we can. Perpetrator only bills, so those are those types of bills that only open or revive or extend any sort of SOL legislation or language only to perpetrators. So those bills really protect institutions, they protect supervisors. And we argue that when we protect institutions that don't protect kids and are not transparent and do not respond appropriately to abuse within those systems, that they should be held liable. And when that happens and we allow institutions to get away with their failures, their horrific failures, that they should not be protected. And most importantly, if we protect institutions that hide and move perpetrators around, we are only making the children of whatever jurisdiction we're in, we're making those children less safe, and we make this known to legislators. We also do not like a gross negligence standard, which is typically, all depending on the statute and the jurisdiction, is having the additional burden of the plaintiff to prove that the negligence was knowing or reckless. And that can be a really big hurdle. Again, depending on the state and the case law that's been established there, that can be an enormous hurdle. And quite frankly, a lot of attorneys won't want to take a case if it's a gross negligence standard, because it's going to be really, really tough to prove. And you know, I often tell legislators that why should someone who is abused by someone in an institution have to jump through this higher standard, I give the example that if it was a school bus driver, for example, and that school bus driver was texting when they were driving and little Johnny was hurt in the bus, that little Johnny would only have to show that the bus driver breached their duty of reasonable care. But if that same little Johnny was sexually abused by the bus driver, there's a higher standard, and they would have to show that that negligence by the institution that hired that bus driver, that was knowing and reckless. And we just find that unacceptable, and we will fight it as much as we can up and down every jurisdiction. There are many challenges in some states' constitutions, depending on the wording. It's almost always about due process. And what we say to folks is the challenge of those state constitutions and their due process language is just, it's just not something that scares us away. We're just not afraid to take that on. We will often say we need to wait for the political climate, the political landscape to be such where we can take it on. But we won't be frightened because that particular state's constitution has due process language that may make it a little bit more challenging. And the reason that we're not easily frightened by this is because we have the leading constitutional scholar leading the way for us. Professor Marcy Hamilton has argued before the Supreme Court. She clerked for Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, and we have a full legal team behind all of our efforts. We have social science researchers, and we have quite a few very skilled attorneys that help us with our research and both social science, and help us write our briefs, our written testimony, all depending on the state. So we have quite a team of very skilled folks that help us in this fight. So we're well equipped with a small army. As many of you know, 2019 was a banner year for statute of limitation reform for child sexual abuse. We had 23 states enact new statute of limitations. So it was just a great year. We had 9 states that enacted either window or revival language. So it was just a banner year for us. We were very pleased with our efforts. You know, in New York, here we are with Marcy Hamilton and I, and our good friend Stephen Menes, with Governor Andrew Cuomo. We worked very closely with Governor Andrew Cuomo and his right-hand woman, Melissa DeRosso. They were wonderful to work with. And this is at the signing of the New York Child Victims Act. And I have to also say that there were so many amazing survivors and advocates in New York that really allowed this to happen. It was an honor to work with all of them. So with the success of 2019, we were like all pumped, ready to go. We had, you know, about 12 states within our crosshairs that we were going to go after in 2020. And of course, COVID struck and just put the brakes on everything for so many different types of legislation. But of course, for the efforts that we were planning to move forward, and even we had draft legislation. And then what happened was, you know, it was like March 31st, and 75% of all legislative bodies were shut down, most because of COVID. So it really put the brakes on our efforts. It was very disappointing. There's only so much that you can do from remotely. Here I am with David Lorenz, a wonderful advocate and fighter. This is in Maryland, along with Delegate C.T. Wilson. Some of you may know C.T. Wilson. He was in that wonderful documentary, The Keepers, just a wonderful man to work with. This was at a press conference outside the Senate Judicial Proceedings Committee. And actually, I had to drive down from Boston. I drove all the way down to Maryland for that because I really couldn't get in a plane, because that's really when COVID was really becoming known to all of us, right? But in 2020, we did have 29 states introduce statute of limitation reform. We had 19 states that were looking to open some type of retroactive legislation, revival or window law. We had both civil and criminal legislation that we were going to work to fight. We had our hands full, but we really were hoping to you know, plow forward and get to these other states. So unfortunately, we only had 2 revival windows. Most recently, the 1-year extension, which again, I worked closely with Melissa DeRosso and some great folks on the ground there. Senator Brad Hoylman and Assemblywoman Linda Rosenthal were both great on these efforts. Quite a few advocates on the ground working to pass this extension. So now effectively New York has a 2-year window, which really, you know, we push for better windows, at least 2 years to offer survivors to come forward and to file their claims. And especially in this COVID environment, it was challenging for folks to come forward. So the breakdown for 2020 was not what we had hoped for. We had 5 criminal statutes changed, and we had 3 civil statutes changed. We had New Hampshire that eliminated the statute of limitations for incest and sexual assault of minors. So they're, you know, all depending on the legislation and the penal laws in each jurisdiction. Sometimes we can eliminate it for more serious types of crimes. And usually the civil statutes are contingent upon the penal statutes. And of course, in New York, we extended the window, and we had some okay legislation in West Virginia. I would have been happier with a better age date on that. So here we are. These were the best statutes that we have, eliminating criminal SOL for not all crimes, but typically the more serious, like Class A felony types of sexual crimes against children, elimination of civil SOL, and then of course our revivals are at 18 jurisdictions. We do a lot of graphs. We're always educating. Legislators can get bored and they have a lot on their plates, and some of them may not have the training and the experience that others have. So we really try to use a lot of graphs and numbers to educate them on what's happening across the country and where their ranking is. We do a lot of shaming from time to time, and when you know, a state legislator or a judicial committee hears that their state is, you know, the worst in the country or with the worst, they don't like to hear it, and it can be very, very effective to really move them. We also share with them, you know, sort of what's happening across the country, this movement to revive child sexual abuse statute of limitations. And when they see that they're sort of behind the movement, we can get some action. Again, it does depend on the climate in each jurisdiction, the political climate, what we have to work with. One of the things we do is we have this report card, and certainly the states that are getting a D+ and an F, they don't like to see this. We just popped New York up to an A. They were down at a B. They didn't like that. But because their window really is now a 2-year window, they were pleased with that. So they don't like seeing that they get bad grades. We'll use this in op-eds. We'll talk about this on the news, at press conferences. again, in committee hearings, they don't like to hear that they're failing in this regard. So we'll use whatever we can to get their attention and to realize that they're really behind in this movement, this movement, civil rights movement for children and justice. So we use this to really support them. So right now we have this, what I call this trifecta of news that is eating up the time and focus of lawmakers and, quite frankly, of news outlets. Usually we can get an op-ed in pretty easily, but right now, there's just no oxygen left in the room. So between COVID-19 legislation that they're focusing on, social justice and police reform legislation, of course, both of these are very important and we get that. And then of course, the November election, these legislative leaders are really concerned about re-election, really concerned about whether the power will shift in their chamber. And now, of course, the vacancy in the US Supreme Court and the political aftermath that is creating in each jurisdiction. So these things are really taking up all the oxygen, making it a little bit harder for us right now to make some significant movement. But the way we think about this is just a pause. We're not finished. We have a ton of work to do all over the country. And quite frankly, I'm not going to stop until every single survivor of child sexual abuse has their day in court, can get the justice that they deserve, and that children are safer. So we wait for the 2021 session. We wait to get through the elections. We hopefully wait till things are safer and people are safer with COVID-19. And we're going to tighten up our gloves. We're going to fight for kids and justice. And quite frankly, there's no stopping us. Here we come, 2020. These are the states that we presently are targeting. We may add other states again, depending on what happens in the November election, what we think we can get through. We never want, that sort of the perfect is the enemy of the good type of thing. We never want to stop a piece of legislation that is a big step in the right direction, but we do strive to get Vermont-like bills, right? So right now what we're focusing on is these states that I've highlighted. We believe that we will add other states, but right now this is our focus. And by the way, folks, if there's anything that you see on the ground, because it's really you advocates and survivors on the ground that help us, we can't do this without you. You have more sort of local wisdom, and we really rely on you heavily and quite frankly, respect you tremendously. So if there's some movement that you think that's not here in these targeted states, please reach out and let us know. And we'll be right there standing shoulder to shoulder with you, fighting for those. I was also going to talk a little bit about what folks can do during this time, because probably the uptick in real advocacy and change won't happen until January, likely mid to end of January, just start. And so I like to talk to folks about what can they do now during this COVID time, especially. And so I really push for folks this is a great time to educate themselves online. Get to know your legislators, get to know the process, figure out what bills are being introduced, what bills got killed, and why, what are the obstacles. There is a ton of information, and these two sites, if you can't write these down quickly, please feel free to reach out and I can share them with folks later. These are great sites to really watch what's going on in different legislative bodies across the country. We also push for advocacy via letters and emails. Write those emails to legislative leaders. Do research on those legislative leaders, just even Google search, news searches on where they stand on particular issues. You know, I like to capture their words about what they believe is important for their jurisdiction or what their campaign themes are. I also tell advocates to always copy their chief of staff and their legislative aides. That's that COS and LAs down below there. So their legislative aides and their chief of staff, always copy them on any emails. And be persistent, keep sending those emails. The power of the press is, you know, just phenomenal. I mean, in New York, the New York Daily News, they were just amazing. They stayed with us. You know, reporters want to educate folks, want to help certain causes. So really writing letters, opinions, talking to reporters. If you see something about a bill that a reporter's wrote on, write to that reporter and give them a different angle if you feel like they've missed that. And just, you know, mention legislators that have held up bills, maybe, you know, committee leaders that have held up bills, leaders in the Senate, all of that stuff. Just mention those, because really the two things that, you know, lawmakers really care about, and there are some really good lawmakers out there, and there's some that are really not doing the work that they need to do, but we've worked with some really wonderful lawmakers. But what they care about is their image, and they care about re-election. So go to their campaign websites, you know, Google them in the news, figure out what they're about. There's lots of great strategies when you do that. And the power of social media, you know, I call it a tag and tell, whether you're on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, just tag those leaders anytime you're posting something on social media, and tag all legislative bodies. Most of them have Facebook accounts, Twitter accounts, Instagram accounts. Individual chambers do, political parties do. Look all this stuff up and just tag away. And they don't, you know, if you're unhappy with them, let them know. And then of course there's direct calls. And when we're able to, we'll have direct meetings. But right now in this COVID time, I recommend that all advocates and survivors to reach out to their district offices, because a lot of folks are simply not in the state house offices. So reach out to their district offices. It's a lot more effective, especially now with COVID. And then I just wanted to say that, you know, it's really normal for all of us to feel super stressed and angry and confused, especially now. And, you know, I think survivors really understand these feelings, probably more than most people. And I would really advocate and push for you to, you know, talk to the people you trust, family, friends, professionals, your therapist, SNAP members, SNAP leaders. The folks at SNAP, as you all know, are amazing. Reach out to those folks for support, because they're really there for you. And I really push for survivors and advocates to really make sure you're engaged in a practice of self-care. Make sure you're seeing your therapist. Lots of therapists. I know my therapist is seeing folks via Zoom. And, you know, try to keep that connection with your therapist. I know most are creating different ways to continue that therapeutic relationship and that support. You know, try to keep routines, you know, whether it's when you eat, you know, making your bed every morning can feel good, especially in this crazy time. You know, try to eat well, drink well, limit your alcohol, limit your caffeine, get a lot of exercise. I mean, exercise is really, there's so much evidence on how it helps with stress. You know, limit your exposure to the news. Sometimes it can be really overwhelming, you know, just turn it all off. Find time for stillness, meditation. There's tons of great meditation apps out there that I list right there. insight timers are wonderful. There's a lot of guided meditations um, on YouTube. Headspace is another great one, 10% Happier. And the Calm app is really super great, very helpful. Try to stay connected with family members as best you can. You know, I haven't seen my mother in almost a year now. But if we can stay connected with family members through FaceTime, phone calls, all of that tech that it's available to us. It's not the same thing as being there, but keeping those connections are really important. Try to volunteer if you can. You know, local neighborhood types of support systems tend to be out there in most neighborhoods. I know the VA has this wonderful pen pal buddy program that's really helpful. And also reach out to your the SNAP national office. Maybe you can help other struggling survivors and they can help make those connections for you. And of course, try to stay busy. And I would recommend stay busy with your advocacy work. There's a lot of advocacy work you can do remotely. And I think the other thing I would really push is that just know, folks, that you're not alone. We're all in this together. And please don't forget that you guys are the heroes. It is through your strength, your voice, your bravery. You are the warriors for justice. And without all of the survivors and the advocates out there, certainly Child US Advocacy and Child USA could not do their work. You are truly the real heroes out there. And this is one of my favorite quotes, right? Just to remember that you're going to win eventually, that the truth wins out and truth matters and justice matters. And so keep on fighting, folks. And please know that we are here for you. And I guess at this time, I can open it to some Q&A if need be, if my monitor is around somewhere.
Oh.
Hi, Mary.
Hi.
Yes.
Can you take your full screen off?
Sure
and
can.
More people can be here, and
sure.
I think she'll open our cameras. I just want to thank you so much. That was so inspiring, so encouraging, and I'm so honored that I was randomly chosen to introduce you, because last year I was randomly chosen to introduce Marcy. So it's a perfect
yes.
connection. But I just want to thank you so much for all the hard work you do on behalf of all of us using your voice. So some of the questions that came through may not be under the heading of this. So if you can't answer them, then
Sure.
we'll just have people put these questions into the community box or wherever, okay?
Sure,
So
I will certainly try my best.
Okay, the first ones we got were, what is Child USA doing in Wisconsin? And we also got Texas and Kansas.
Kansas, I think I said was the last state I flew to when I was allowed to fly, working with some great folks there. So to answer questions on specific jurisdictions and legislation, again, this is the time that we need advocates on the ground to reach out to us. But we will also, you know, soon as we see that a bill is ready to roll out, we will be there. So right now in Wisconsin, I do not believe there is presently a bill, but if there are advocates that are sharing right now that are on this Zoom presentation, I am happy to work with folks and look at either existing legislation or write legislation and work with whoever they think the sponsor would be best for. You know, so again, this is where I rely on you folks, because I'm not on the ground in Wisconsin. I learned a lot from folks in Kansas about who should we reach out to, who shouldn't we reach out to. And the other thing is that we're also waiting to see how things pan out after the November election, who would be a good sponsor, who may not be able to sponsor because they weren't reelected, you know, so a lot of that comes into play as well. So right now we don't have a specific piece of legislation that we're working on, but we'd certainly be happy to do one.
Okay. There was a question about, is there any science about common things wrong with predators?
Yes, there is. There is a lot of science on that. We don't tend to focus on that. And the reason being is we want to educate lawmakers on, usually what we want to educate them on is, A, what does it do to the victim? B, what is the lifelong effects of child sexual abuse? C, why do survivors take what they believe is too long to come forward? And then finally, D, what effect this continuing bad law will have on the children in their jurisdiction. So because we have to focus on those four things, we don't typically focus on the psychological data that's out there on predators necessarily.
Okay, and what can we do legally if we were abused by a priest as a young adult, I guess, versus a child?
Yeah. First of all, know that you're not alone. I know that was a legal question, but know that you're not alone. I always tell folks to seek out legal counsel, to go to the police, to fill out a police report, maybe fill out multiple police reports, and to reach out to folks like us, Child USA, Child US Advocacy, right? And but legally, I depending on the jurisdiction, again, every jurisdiction is different. You know, what you can do and can't do is going to be based on the law that's presently there. But certainly reach out to the police, reach out to a therapist, reach out to an attorney. And if you're not getting anywhere, reach out to us. And we will try to push you in the right direction where you can have your voice heard and you can have the justice that you deserve.
Thank you. Tim, law?
Yes, Kathryn, I'm from Ending Clergy Abuse, and we submitted a friend of the court brief to the Polish Supreme Court late last year, and our ECA member Anna Franciszka argued to the Supreme Court, and it was held that the Polish Catholic Church is responsible for the abuse by their clergy. But the brief was written by Marcy Hamilton in your group under our name. So thank you very much.
Yeah, they're brilliant. We got a brilliant team. I'm usually the person that goes out there swinging, punching, and you know, I get a lot of the great legal work and social science research, and I become the mouthpiece. Right, I'm allowed to do that. I'm allowed to take some below the belt hits, or excuse me, deliver below the belt hits. So I'm happy that I'm able to do that, and I'm happy that Child USA was able to help you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You have a great example of language. Sorry, there are a group of moms working on legislation in Ohio. They started with grooming and enticement. Do you have a great example of language that they can use for their state? The last grooming law was deemed non-constitutional and the wording was too generic.
Too generic, yeah. So I would have to, yes, I do, but I'd have to look at that. So if that person could share that with me, I believe my email is at the end of this slide somewhere. If not, Zach, I fully deputize you to give my email out. So I would have to look at it, is the short answer. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to skirt the issue, but I would have to really have my eyes on the legislation.
Okay. When we're lobbying legislators, do you find generally that it's unstrategic to focus on abuse in the Catholic Church?
Again, that depends on the body. So we do research, who are we testifying in front of, right? Who is, what particular lawmaker may have some sort of connection with the Catholic Church, or maybe the Boy Scouts of America, or this maybe another educational institution. So we try to do our research and figure out who's got what connections and who we can focus on. We also do research on who's in power, how do people vote on other pieces of legislation. So that's really dependent on what's out there. But generally speaking, our focus has been not to focus on the Catholic Church necessarily, because we come across as anti-Catholic all the time. Of course, we're not anti-Catholic. I went to Catholic school for 12 years, Our Lady of Psychological Warfare, right? And I get it. I believe in the teachings of Christ. I think that's great. This is not anti anything. This is pro-justice. Our movement is about pro-protecting children, pro-justice. So if we find that there are folks that are in this particular committee that are either Catholic or very devout Catholic or lean Catholic or have friends that are, whatever it is, we may try to take our focus away from that, right? And I will share openly that I went to Catholic school for 12 years. I was abused in the family. So it's really not necessarily a Catholic thing. It's a societal problem, right, folks? We know that this is ubiquitous. This is, we see it everywhere, right? So we try to take that focus away, because then they'll flip it as if we're just a bunch of angry women who don't like Catholics. So we try to avoid that.
Yes. Okay, this one is specifically about Texas, but it's going to be the last question, so you can answer it in general, and we'll have your contact information.
Yeah.
Texas legislative is back in session 2021. I and advocates from Child USA submitting legislation to open a window for adult survivors. Oh, they'd like help from Child USA.
We're in. Yes, we will help you. Absolutely. We are there to help. And I should say that I'm dealing with 50 states. So if you don't hear from me immediately, it's just because I've got maybe 20 states on my desk right now, right? So I tell folks all the time, be a pest. I'm good at being a pest, right? Just be a pest, and don't be afraid to, if you have somehow slipped through my cracks, just because I'm dealing with so many jurisdictions and so many different bills, please send me another email. I'm fine with that. Okay. And we're happy to work with Texas.
One thing survivors can do to support efforts in other states other than their own, because we often talk to people who are from other states.
I think the same type of advocacy with a little bit of a tweak, writing to those leaders, lawmakers in that particular jurisdiction, giving advice. So we'd give advice, especially in New York, because it was just such an insane 13-year battle. We would give advice about some of the strategies that would work with some folks that wouldn't work with others. So if those advocates on the ground know that, I think they should do their best to share, whether they're sharing with SNAP or Darkness to Light, whatever the organization may be. I think, look at folks, we're all in this fight together, all right? We're all fighting for justice and to make kids safer. And the more we can pool our wisdom, our experience, our efforts, our hearts together to help other survivors have justice and kids in other jurisdictions be safer, I'm all for it. So I think sharing the wisdom and maybe even, you know, the battle wounds that we have or scars, right? There's a lot of wisdom in that, right? We all learn. And I think just sharing that is helpful.
Okay, I'm going to jam in one last quick question, hopefully
Sure.
before we get cut off. Will you respond to messages through the conference platform, or do we need to reach out via email?
I will respond in any way the powers that be allow you to reach out to me.
Great.
So, yes.
Thank you so much, Kathryn. This has been wonderful. Appreciate
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Zach. Thank you, Snap.
You've gotten a lot of thank yous and wonderful in the chat.
Great. Thank you so much, folks.